Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Last year, the US-based organization Hindus for Human Rights brought out a stinging critique of Hindu nationalism and Islamophobia in India. And whilst that critique was endorsed by almost all the top Hindu religious leaders in America, as well as right through the diaspora, almost none of the leading Hindu religious leaders in India endorsed it. So earlier this year, in February and March, Hindus for Human Rights carried out what they call a Prema Yatra, and its specific intention was searching for Hindu religious leaders who are concerned about the state of affairs in India. Joining me now to talk about the outcome of that yatra and what they found to be the opinion of leading Hindu religious leaders is the Executive Deputy Director of the organization, Nikhil Mandalaparathi. Nikhil, let me start by asking you not about the outcome of your yatra and what assessment you made of the views of leading Hindu religious leaders in India. I'll come to that later. Let me ask first about the yatra itself. How extensive was it? How many states did you travel through? How many cities did you visit? How many people did you meet?
Right. Thank you so much, Karan, for this opportunity to share about our work. So our yatra started in the beginning of February of this year and concluded in about middle of March or so, so a little bit over a month. We traveled across 9 different states in India, spanning both the north and the south, 12 cities in total, in addition to various smaller towns and villages around each of those 12 cities. We met with about nearly 30 religious leaders, ranging from temple priests to heads of mutts or monastic institutions and gurus with their own ashrams and followers, spanning kind of the diversity of Hindu traditions and sects in the country. And throughout the yatra, we had conversations with each of them about the state of affairs in India today, their views on some of the rising hate and violence going on. And so this yatra spanned many of the important religious sites and pilgrimage centers in the country, ranging from Hfhr to Rishikesh, Ayodhya, Varanasi, as well as major metropolitan areas like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Trivandrum.
So it was in a sense a pan-Indian yatra, wasn't it?
Yes, it was pan in the sense of we got the north and south. I think east and west will have to come back for another yatra, but it was as representative as we could make it in the short time that we had.
Now, you say that you found out during your yatra things that were both deeply concerning but also incredibly inspiring. Let's start with the deeply concerning. I'll come to the inspiring afterwards. You write, and I'm quoting you, "We encountered a pervasive sense of victimhood or resentment among Indian Hindus, deeply intertwined with hatred towards India's Muslim minority." Tell me more about this.
Yeah, and in the course of our conversations that we had with many of these religious leaders across the country, there were quite a few themes that emerged in the course of our conversations. Themes such as bringing up medieval history and views of Hindu identity based on, for example, destruction of temples. And another big theme was atrocities committed against Hindu populations in India's neighboring countries, so Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. We heard about basically a sense in which and this is not unique to India or the Hindu population, but this phenomenon where the majority population in a country feels like they're the ones under attack and that they have kind of imbibed this sort of persecution complex. This is something that I see in the United States where I live among
You said
white
that
Americans.
we encountered a pervasive sense of victimhood or resentment. In other words, this was a common theme with practically all the people you met.
This was a theme in many of the more depressing conversations we had. So we had a set of conversations. Many of those religious leaders were concerned about the state of affairs in India, very much and with us. But a good portion of the religious leaders we met did express very much a sense of victimhood and resentment. And a way in which this, I think, broadly speaking, the Hindu identity in India today has been transformed into one that's based on fear and insecurity of, Hindus are under attack and we need to stand up and fight back. And who are we fighting back against? That is the other who is perceived to be the Muslim population.
This is where you use the word hatred. Did you really mean to use a stronger word as that? Your sentence is, and I'm repeating it for the audience, Indian Hindus are deeply intertwined with hatred towards India's Muslim minority. Did you mean to use that word, hatred?
I think hatred definitely encompasses some of the more disturbing and depressing conversations we had with some of these swamis and gurus and acharyas. Actually,
And these were credible people.
These are people who are spending their lives addressing thousands of people at religious gatherings, discourses, people with their own temples and ashrams. These are all people of significant religious authority in their own respective
These are
areas
people who
and
influence
domains.
other Hindus.
Absolutely. I mean, the very first conversation that we had was with a Swami in rural Uttar Pradesh who went on, and this is the very beginning of our yatra, but he was repeating all of these tropes about how barbaric Muslims are for slaughtering animals for Eid and other celebrations, leaving aside that Hindus also do this for Kali and Durga and other goddesses. He talked about the threat of love jihad and how Muslim men are seducing Hindu women away. And the way he was doing it, he is someone who tells kathas and Puranic stories for masses, and it was almost like you talk about some Rakshasa or Asura. It was that sort of like level of, he almost had a smile on his face as he was talking about how
And
evil
this is
these
when
people
you
are.
sensed hate.
Absolutely. I think hate is the only way I could describe what I was hearing in many of these conversations, not just with this
I'm just
Swami,
picking
but
this up for
others.
the audience because I think it's particularly significant. A very large number of Hindu religious leaders who are credible and significant, leaders who influence others, actually led you to believe they hate Muslims.
Yeah. I think and that's the most worrying thing, is that their influence that they hold over.
Now you
thousands
say,
of
and I'm
people.
quoting you, we saw the extent to which Indian Muslims have been dehumanized in the minds of many Indian Hindus and in the minds of their religious leaders. What do you mean by dehumanized? Can you explain that more fully?
Yeah, I think there's one anecdote which I think really illustrates this well. When I was in Karnataka, I met with a number of Lingayat leaders, which is a major religious community in that state. The beginning of my meeting I had with one of the leading Lingayat institutions, my interlocutors were telling me how the Lingayat tradition is built on principles of human equality, social justice, human rights. This is the tradition of Basavanna, Akka Mahadevi, Allama Prabhu, talking so much about how aligned they felt with the organization like Hindus for Human Rights. And at the same time, when the conversation turned to communal hatred and Islamophobia, it was like the floodgates open, and it was all of the same sort of tropes that we would hear from any Hindu nationalist organization.
Give me an example of the sort of things that came out of their mouths at that point of time.
So they were talking, for example, about the population growth of Muslims in Karnataka being, quote, out of control, and how Hindus would soon become a minority in Karnataka, with Muslims having so many children and taking over kind of the population. They talked about Muslims never speaking up when any violence emerges from their community, and that Hindus are always forced to speak up. And there was just this sense of like Hindus being under attack in Karnataka from the Muslim kind of population.
And as a result of feeling under attack, rightly or wrongly, their attitude to Muslims is to dehumanize them.
I think it was just this sheer cognitive dissonance where you can go from 1 minute of talking about our tradition teaches us to fight against caste and to treat all people equally, to then segue very easily and with no kind of second thought into these people are taking over and these people are violent and these people are, uncivilized.
You say you were told by Hindu religious leaders that Indian Muslims are, and I'm quoting you again, insular, violent, and hostile. Apparently, one Swami in Uttar Pradesh said Muslims do not know the concept of humanity. Now, to me as a layman, when I read that, I get the feeling that not only are these Hindus that you met, these Hindu religious leaders that you met, failing to consider Muslim brothers, they're probably failing to consider them fellow citizens.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the really dangerous shifts that's happened over the last several years, not just 2014, but before that, in this sense in which the Muslim is seen as an inherent other and someone who can never really be considered as Indian as a Hindu. And I had this experience with one of the Swamis that we talked to where he was actually praising the Muslims in his town, in his city that he lived in, saying what was so great about them is that you couldn't tell that they were Muslim, that the men didn't have beards, they didn't have topis, the women didn't wear abayas or burqas. Basically, he was saying our Muslims, this town's Muslims, are so assimilated into appearing as
they look like Hindus
that you can't even tell they're Muslim, and that's what makes them the ideal Muslim.
In other words, Muslims that don't look like Muslims, Muslims that don't have beards, Muslims that don't wear a hijab, Muslims that culturally have assimilated so much they're indistinguishable, those are the acceptable ones. Shed your Muslim identity and you become acceptable to us.
Right, that is what at least this one Swami that we met was.
Now, you also met a Swami in Maharashtra. And again, I'm quoting you. He was the leader of a prominent and wealthy Vaishnav sect, and he insisted that Hindus face much greater discrimination than Indian Muslims and Indian Christians. Is that what you mean when we earlier talked about a pervasive sense of victimhood?
Right. I think that's exactly what, when you have this sense within a majority population that they're the ones who are under attack, that they're the ones who are being discriminated against in, quote, their own country. I think that mindset is informed a lot by misinformation, by social media, by WhatsApp forwards. And what's scary is that it's reaching people who have such high influence within communities. I mean, this Swami that I was meeting, as he was telling us things such as 60% of the Tirupati temple's endowment goes towards the Andhra Pradesh Waqf board, and all sorts of kind of crazy statistics showing that Hindus are the ones being drained of their money and power in this country. While we were talking, we had a stream of devotees coming and doing pranam and touching his feet and seeking his blessings while he was saying these sort of very hateful and bigoted things. And so that's the scary thing. It's not just an everyday person.
The other thing that I get as an impression from you is that the religious leaders, and I keep emphasizing these are religious leaders you met, not ordinary lay Hindus.
Exactly.
They seem to be unaware of the fact that they're talking in hateful terms about Muslims. They're so used to it. It's so commonplace for them that they don't realize that they're expressing hatred for fellow citizens.
Right. And there's a sense in which some of these religious leaders, they didn't say, we don't want Muslims in India. We don't want any Muslims around us. They weren't saying that necessarily, but they were saying, we want Muslims who will, for example, look just like us and assimilate just to be as a Hindu from the outside. And we want Muslims who will know their limits and not assert themselves too much, because then that's a problem. So that's the image that we were getting.
Now, you were told by the trustee of an ashram in Uttar Pradesh that the Hindu nationalist group Rashtriya Swamsevak Sangh, now once again I'm quoting you, has been trying to infiltrate ashrams and temples in rural communities, sending its members to spend a few days at a time to plant the seeds of polarization. From your impression of these rural communities where the RSS is trying to infiltrate, are those communities vulnerable or are they fighting back and resisting?
I think both are true depending on the context. The ashram that you just mentioned, they had a sense that, okay, they had someone who was visiting from RSS who was staying for a few days. They all seemed a little bit exasperated with the things that he was saying, but they are like, we are an ashram, we have to host whoever comes here, and hopefully he'll leave in a few days. And as a community, we'll make things right, and we'll make sure that this doesn't stay in our community. They were very committed to making sure that the communal harmony in that community was unchanged. But that's not true for all of the villages and rural areas that we went to. I was spending some time in Bihar on this trip, near the villages around Muzaffarpur, where we met with a Swami who was very, very concerned about this state of affairs in the country. He was very much against Islamophobia, against Hindu nationalism. And he has this small ashram surrounded by a few villages. And he said, I feel completely lonely and abandoned by my own people around me because they've been so infected by.
But the
by
important
hate.
point you're pointing out is that the RSS is actually sending delegations of people to ashrams and temples, and to quote you, to sow and plant the seeds of polarization. The RSS itself, you're saying, is actually increasing division between Hindus and Muslims.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we heard from one of the ashrams that we visited.
They'll descend on you like a ton of bricks. You're absolutely sure about what you're saying.
I'm just repeating what I heard straight from that trustee.
And you heard this
ashram.
fairly often.
Yes, and this is not just limited to the RSS, but there's so many different Hindu nationalist groups that are sowing these sort of seeds of polarization.
And you
across
heard this
the country.
frequently.
Yes, this is
So
repeated.
not just the RSS, but Hindu nationalist groups in rural communities are deliberately visiting temples and ashrams to plant the seeds of polarization.
Right, that's correct.
And plant the seeds of polarization means to increase divisions and differences between Hindus and Muslims.
That's the primary goal, is to really, whatever communities where we know that even today there are certain, for example, festivals, shared traditions, shared moments when a community gathers together, those are increasingly the sites of Hindu nationalist mobilization. For example, in Karnataka, you have...
And that's when they also sow the seeds of polarization.
Right, saying that,
So at a moment of festivity when joy and happiness should be the theme, they're actually planting the seeds of polarization.
Yeah, we see this in Karnataka, for example. There are these conflicts over temple festivals where either traditionally you have Muslim vendors who are, part of that jatra or festival, or in some cases, like in Belur, the verses from the Quran are traditionally recited before the Rathotsava.
Now that sort of thing is being objected to.
Those are these Hindu nationalist groups come in and say, this is not how Hindus should celebrate. This is not the proper way to do a Hindu
In other words, remove the presence of Muslims. Remove them as vendors, remove this chanting of the Quran, end any Muslim influence.
Right, exactly.
Let's come to the inspiring side of this yatra. I think it's important that we should balance our conversation, because although a lot of your findings were deeply distressing and disturbing, there were some which you say were inspiring. You write, one temple priest in Varanasi told us that his idea of dharma is inseparable from humanity. Manavta, you translate that as, which he said was the opposite of Hindu nationalism. How reflective was this temple priest of the people you met? Or was he unique and alone?
I would say the priests and religious leaders who are concerned about the state of affairs in India today made up at least half, if not more, of the religious leaders that we met with.
This is very reassuring. At least half, if not more. In other words, over 50% of Hindu religious leaders were actually concerned about the distressing and disturbing state of communal relationships between Hindus and Muslims.
Yes, but this is important to know that our itinerary and the meetings that we had were all based on previous recommendations from partner organizations and grassroots groups who were saying these are religious leaders who may be already inclined and who may be concerned about the state of affairs. So we were limiting our sample to people who we had some hope in to begin with. And so that's who
So
we
you
were trying
didn't
to
randomly choose leaders you didn't know?
No, we
In other words, you were guided towards people you'd be told about.
Exactly. We were trying to
But
find...
then how do you know the people you met and the opinions you got are reflective? Because clearly this is not a random selection.
Right. This is not a random survey of all Hindus in
But there's a second thing.
India.
It's not a random selection. And that in itself raises questions about therefore how accurate or reflective it is. But leave that aside. The other thing is, if over 50%, those are your words, if over 50% of the people you met actually are concerned about the state of relationship, then the majority of the people you met actually gave you inspiring answers.
Yes, but that inspiring answers were also coupled with a sense of we feel so isolated, we feel so alone, we feel like we're the only ones in our community who feel this way.
Except that that's not true. If the majority of people you met were actually concerned about the state of affairs, even if they say they feel alone, as far as your sample is concerned, they are the majority. It's a minority that were depressing and distressing.
Right.
This is the opposite of the impression that one gets from the article you wrote from Religion News. There, the emphasis seems to be on the distressing and the depressing. But now, in this conversation, I realized that the majority of people were inspiring, not depressing, not distressing.
Right. We were limiting our search to people who we had heard were already concerned about.
This is
state
now
of
becoming
affairs.
a good news rather than a bad news story.
I mean, the Prema Yatra, the Prema part of the Yatra definitely was something that we experienced and something that we are inspired by. Of course,
You also said, I'm quoting you, one Swami in Haryana simply stated to us, and I'm quoting him now, India has never had only one religion.
Right.
This is a pluralistic land.
Yeah.
And then you add religious diversity, he said, i.e. the Haryana Swami said, was at the heart of what it means to be Indian. He's absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and this was a sentiment that was repeated by several other people that we met.
So he's not a lone voice.
There was a priest in Varanasi who was talking about specifically the renovations and the activities that the BJP government has been putting into place.
But Nikhil, do you realize that the second half of our discussion has completely overturned the impact of the first half? And it completely differs from the article you wrote for Religion News. You wrote a very similar article for Scroll.in as well.
Right.
That article conveys the impression that the disturbing examples were the dominant ones. It now turns out that actually the majority of people were inspiring. And as you say, this Swami in Haryana, who said that India is a pluralistic land, religious diversity is at the heart of what it means to be, you said that sentiment was expressed to you by many people.
Right. And I will say that there were...
So this is a good news story. I'm changing the way I began. This is now a good news story, not a bad news story.
There's both. I think both are definitely
But hang on a second. There can't be both if the majority of people, and I'm quoting you, actually were inspiring.
But that was a very difficult search, right, to identify these people. We know that we couldn't just cast our net and try to visit every major temple in the country or every Hindu institution. We had to limit our search to...
But you don't know about those you didn't visit, so you can't bring them up to cite that they were going to be depressing or distressing. You just don't know. So let's stick to those you met.
Right.
Those you met, the majority of them were inspiring, reassuring, concerned about the state of Hindu-Muslim relationship, right?
Yeah.
They were actually aware that this is not the way things should be.
Right. And so I think what the impression that we got from these religious leaders was that many of them were individually quite concerned about what was happening in India, but there was a very deep sense of fear about, okay, I feel maybe inside myself, I feel individually very concerned, but if I express this, I don't want to put my temple at risk, my ashram at risk. Many of these swamis have already faced significant violence and attacks.
You write about that. You say, you were struck by, and I'm quoting you, the pervasive sense of fear among the religious leaders you met, some of whom have faced violence from Hindu nationalists. Their ashrams and temples have been vandalized and attacked. They have faced accusations of being Naxalite or Maoist rebels. These are the inspiring, aware, concerned leaders, but they're under pressure, you say, from Hindu nationalists to change their viewpoint.
They are under pressure to just not say anything at all. I mean, there's a real backlash that has occurred for some of these swamis and leaders when they've made public statements, when they've posted on social media, when they've spoken out in favor of religious pluralism and equality. There's a real risk that they're running of putting their own lives at
What I don't
stake.
understand is this. And I said this in my introduction, when you, as an organization, came up with your stinging critique of Hindu nationalism and Islamophobia in India last year, you say a majority of Hindu religious leaders in America and across the diaspora endorsed the statement, but very, very few Hindu religious leaders in India did. And yet, the majority of the Hindu religious leaders in India you met expressed concerns about the state of Hindu-Muslim relations. Right?
But they don't feel comfortable saying so in public. That's the challenge. That's the real chilling effect that's happened over the last few years, where they can express, in a closed room, whatever they feel in their hearts, but they know that if I say this in public, if I'm quoted in a newspaper, if my picture shows up next to this quote, then I'm a target. Then I am someone who will be identified as an obstacle that needs to be removed. So that's the challenge, is even though we may have met people who are quite aligned with us, who are really concerned, who feel very pained at what's happening in the country, they are just under such this cage of fear and knowing the potential repercussions that could
So
happen
let
to them.
me see if I've understood you correctly. A majority of the Hindu religious leaders you met share your concern about the state of the country, share your concern about the very poor relationship between Hindus and Muslims, share your concern about the way we're othering Muslims and treating them. But, and the but is very important, they're hesitant, if not scared, to say this publicly
Yeah,
because they're worried about the response from Hindu nationalist groups.
absolutely. I mean, I have
So this tells us, doesn't it, of the incredible influence that Hindu nationalist groups have and the fear that they intimidate people with.
Yeah, I've seen it firsthand. There's this fiery Swami in Karnataka who I met. If you look at his writings, his activism over the last several decades, he's just this kind of beacon of calling the very violence and hate at the heart of Hindu nationalism. He has called it out and rejected it. And this is someone who has faced in the last several years very intense threats and violence from the Hindu right in Karnataka. And I met him just a few months back. This is a man who had totally just he was just terrified to even spend 5-10 minutes talking to me, and he had almost kind of given up. I mean, he told me you just can't convince narrow-minded people, and this is someone who has a record of being a much more active, radical voice who has just been completely extinguished by this sort of hate and threats.
So let me put it like this. The good news is tempered by concern about the impact and the fear and intimidation of Hindu nationalist groups. But the good news is that the majority of the Hindu religious leaders you met actually share your concern about the state of the country.
Right.
The bad news, which tempers that good news, is that practically all of them are scared that if they speak out in public, as opposed to behind closed doors, Hindu nationalist groups, Hindu religious right-wing groups will intimidate them, will vandalize their ashrams and their temples. That is the bad news.
That's the challenge, right? Because it's great for us to know, within our organization, okay, we have these contacts, these people that we can talk to, but the next phase is how do we make sure that this voice shows up in the world?
That's the question.
Yeah.
How long will these people, even behind closed doors, express their concerns? Are you worried that a point may come when, out of fear of Hindu nationalist groups, even the concerns they express in private will stop being expressed?
It would be a very sad day to see all of these amazing, fiery people that we met just give up. But
are you worried that might happen?
I think each of them are committed in a very deep way, at least in this private interactions that we've had so far. They are committed to standing for what they believe in, which is, peace and diversity and justice.
So at this point of time, that fear is an unreal fear. The fear that they may completely stop even in private speaking out, that is an unreal fear.
I think so. I would agree with that.
Finally, you end your piece for Religion News, and I believe you end your piece for Scroll the same way, with the following sentence. What is more dangerous is the near absolute silence of the Hindu majority. Now, if I understood that sentence correctly, you're no longer talking about Hindu religious leaders, you're talking about the majority of Hindu people, lay Hindu people, right? Not leaders. And there, your concern is, why aren't they speaking out? Why aren't they fighting back? What is the answer? Is it because they share the concern and sentiment and hatred for Muslims? Or is it because they too are scared that if they speak out, they could become victims or targets of Hindu nationalist groups? Which of the two?
I think fear is animating a lot of the silence that we see from everyday Hindus in India and in the diaspora. I think there's a real sense of you see the violence that some of these right-wing groups are capable of unleashing on the streets, and you don't want to ever be kind of associated with that. You don't want to put yourself on the line for reasons of self-preservation. But I think that is starting to change. The reason that we...
Change in which direction?
In a positive direction. I think that,
The fear is diminishing
I think we at Hindus for Human Rights are trying to do this work in the diaspora of mobilizing Hindus to stand up against hate in the name of their tradition. And in just the last few weeks, in response to the Ram Navami violence and Hanuman Jayanti violence of this year, there is a group called Indian Hindus Against Hate that is starting to come together and mobilize on this in this very public way. Because there's I think a sense in which many Indian Hindus who are concerned about these issues have spoken up as saying, I am secular, I am an Indian, but to say that I am a Hindu and I oppose what's happening in the name of my identity.
That's the difficult thing.
That is that final barrier that I think is the missing link in a lot of
But you get the feeling that we're moving towards overcoming that barrier as well.
I hope so. I mean, this is what I'm
seeing.
seeing.
You get the feeling we are.
I can't say that I feel that the Hindu majority in India is overwhelmingly shifting to standing up for the rights of minorities. I don't think it's accurate to say that that's broad sense, that's where the Hindu population is going. But I am seeing more and more Indian Hindus standing up. And
let me put a conclusion of what I have got out of this chat with you and ask you whether it's correct. And that conclusion is a very simple one. The majority of Hindu religious leaders that you met actually share your concerns about the deteriorating Hindu-Muslim relationship and the way Muslims are othered and the way they are treated. Perhaps even a majority of Hindu people share that concern. The problem is, whether we're talking about Hindu religious leaders or Hindu lay people, the fear is that Hindu nationalist groups will attack them, will target them if they speak out their concerns, and therefore they speak those concerns only behind closed doors. Is that a correct conclusion?
I think that's right. That this fear is really what is the barrier to a real shift in Indian society and a shift in the way that people relate to each other.
The fear is the concern.
The fear, the chilling effect that leads you to just keep your critiques to just your family or your friends, and this fear to say anything in public, that is what allowed.
But there's a corollary to that. Right? The majority of Hindu religious leaders, the majority of the lay Hindu people are both Hindu and secular. They're just scared to say so, and they're certainly scared to say it up front and in public.
The majority of the leaders that we met felt this way.
I can only talk about the majority of leaders you met.
Right.
But the majority of leaders you met are Hindu and secular, but they are scared to say this in public because of the response and reaction of Hindu nationalist groups.
That's correct, yeah.
So it's a good news story, tempered by the fear of saying in public what you can only express in private.
Exactly. The good news is there. I don't want to discount that. That is the heart of what we're doing, is to uplift that progressive, inclusive voice from within.
Nikhil Mandalaparthi, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Hfhr. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.